When I realize my conscious oneness with God, if you ask me for help, isn't it very clear that God directed you to me? That was what happened. You were drawn into my experience. Therefore, the connection's already made between us, so that whatever of truth is realized by me must be at that same instant appearing in you. Therefore, when you ask for help, the contact with my spiritual consciousness was made, and now whatever truth takes place in my consciousness appears as harmony, whether it's of your body or your pocketbook or your business or your home, because my oneness with God is my oneness with you. Therefore, all that the Father is to me, the Father is to you. You almost might liken it to electricity coming through a fixture with two bulbs. As long as the bulbs are at one with the electricity, they're going to both have light. And so it is that as long as you have been drawn to me, we are now both at one with our source, God. And therefore, as soon as God flows, it flows to both of us, or all of us. In that way, then, we do not give a treatment to anybody, but as practitioners, we know the truth. Now, there isn't any truth about a human being, because a human being is a branch of a tree that's cut off and withereth, and a human being isn't under the grace of God. The only truth there is about God. And therefore, our treatment is on the realm of God. In our treatment, we realize the omnipresence of God, the omnipotence of God, the omniscience, the all-wisdom of God, the all-knowledge, the all-power, the all-presence. We acknowledge God as the only law operating. And when we have adequately, sufficiently realized all that we can about God, then we may turn to the era, the appearance, whether it be physical, mental, moral, financial, or human relation, and say, ah, yes, that's an appearance. That's the arm of flesh. That is the mirage on the desert. A picture, but not a reality. That is the carnal mind, or nothingness. That is the arm of flesh, or nothingness. That is not a power, not a law, has nothing of God to sustain it, and in that way wipe it out. So a treatment has two parts to it: the realization of God and knowing consciously the nature of the error as a nothingness, as an activity of the human belief in two powers. You'll get all of the details in the writings. I'll only briefly summarize those 2 points. And it is for this reason, then, that our work has nothing to do with treating patients. It has to do with knowing the truth about God and knowing the facts about the nature of error. Now, of course, on the whole, the spoken word is not necessary, and one's realization of these truths is sufficient. On the other hand, there are times when the word orally spoken to an individual does something for them. And it is for this reason very often that when students write to me for help, knowing how much I travel, that I am very apt to say, it may be that you would like to talk to one of our practitioners or have a closer contact with them, and then I provide them with the names of those who are actively practicing. Because sometimes, in some cases, with some individuals, the spoken word will do something that the other will not do. In the same way that I've explained this to you, that sometimes I will get a letter telling me that the patient knows just when I received the letter because they got their help at that time. And in some cases that may be so, but it isn't necessarily so, because actually the help should be received before the letter's in the mailbox on its way to me. The letter should be received before my telephone bell rings, if you're ringing it. The help should be received before the cable you send reaches me. Why? Because it isn't my human knowing or my human mind or body that's doing anything for you. It is this life that we're living, this life of consciousness of one power, one presence. And when you touch that, you have done it. Can effective treatment work be done for a person who has not requested help, but for whom help is asked by a loved one or friend? Very often, yes. There is, however, one thing to keep in mind. I've told you that freedom is one of the greatest subjects there is on the face of the globe. Since I am dedicated to spiritual healing, I wouldn't appreciate anyone coming to me to tell me about the finest medicine or the finest surgeon in the world, or the newest way to materially heal disease. I respect everyone else in the same way. And if people are putting their faith in materia medica and their hope, even though I would certainly, if the opportunity presented, at least bring some attention, bring to them some attention of a spiritual healing, I would never give them a treatment or urge a treatment upon them unless it were with their consent. Now, there are differences, there are exceptions. When it is the insane, the mentally unstable, that's entirely different. They are not in a position to know what they want for themselves, and whoever is closest to them should make the decision. So it is with children. A child can't possibly know, and therefore a parent can make the decision. Very often, a close relationship between husband and wife, and even if the one doesn't want it, the mate has a right to their own spiritual life and whatever will bring harmony to them, and they may give treatment. The only thing that I say is never inflict a treatment on those who specifically don't want it. But wherever it is a case of someone in the family that knows nothing of this, or is dangerously ill, sometimes unto death, or mentally unbalanced, certainly we should give our help. When we discover that they definitely do not want it, that's our time to stop and to withdraw, allowing everyone their own freedom. But actually, I have seen wonderful, wonderful results by giving help to those whom a wife or a husband has asked for their mate or for their child or for their parent. And I would certainly continue as long as there's no opposition to it. Have there been cases of healing of senility and insanity? Indeed. Insanity is one of the simpler problems in this kind of work. How would you approach a case? That you'll have to study from your classwork and the writings. But here is something I warn you about. It says here, often they are unresponsive, self-willed, and resentful. If you're treating them, they have nothing to do with the case. They can be anything they like. They can jump out of windows if they want. That has nothing to do with those who are treating the case. Whether they are self-willed or not, whether they are stubborn or obstinate, has nothing to do with the case. All that has to do with the case is the practitioner. What does the practitioner know? What life is the practitioner living? How real does error seem to the practitioner? That's what determines the case, not what the patient's doing. Why, if the patient weren't unresponsive, if the patient weren't self-willed, if the patient weren't resentful, they wouldn't be mentally unbalanced. But you know, without those qualities, we'd be angels. No, the more those conditions exist, the more they need our help. And that's why, too, the question often comes up, what about if they're sinning? The harder they're sinning, the more they need us. After many years of mental practice and using names as well as lists of causes, I am finding it very difficult to keep the patient from popping back into my mind. The lists of causes have not been too difficult because I had already found out they were not true. Could you please help me? Yes, indeed, I can. Do not be concerned with the difficulties that you meet in making this transition. Be assured they are difficulties and will continue to be for some time, but let them be. Just you do your best in your way, and gradually you will find the old way will fade out. Meanwhile, no harm will be done, because your main attention will be centered on the real work that you're doing. And right here, let me bring something to your attention that's very seldom spoken of, but I'm sure very often experienced. Since we are all, to some extent, human, since we have not entirely risen into our Christhood, human thoughts will pop into our head. And when we are treating, it shouldn't be thought unusual if a fear thought comes into our mind. It shouldn't be thought unusual sometimes if resentment comes into our mind, or we may recently have been reading some piece of politics and gotten a bit heated about it. Don't be disturbed if things like that come into your mind, and don't be surprised sometimes if even very sensual thoughts come into your mind. They can. They're not your thoughts. They come from out here. We pick them up in the air. And I don't know of anyone who has gotten so far that at some time some of these very, very mundane human thoughts have come in. I have witnessed the Master, Jesus Christ, even when he was in the ministry, had 3 horrible temptations up there in that wilderness. Terrible temptation. Mundane thoughts came into his mind about fear of lack, about wanting self-aggrandizement, showing forth personal power. You remember it all, under the 3 temptations. And there he was, a master already. A master, and being tempted with self-fame or personal powers and lack. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, look at the temptations that came to him. Can you not watch with me 1 hour? Can you not stay awake tonight and pray with me? What was he worried about? Well, it wasn't worry, but there was a nagging in there. What is my real demonstration? Should I submit to this, or what is God's will? Doubts come, even as late as that part of the ministry. And so if very human and mundane thoughts come into your mind, even when you're treating, don't be disturbed by it. Just flick them out. And just remember, they weren't your thoughts. Paul told us the truth about them. I find in me no sin, but in me there still remains a sense of sin. In other words, the world is still plaguing me. And so it is. You will find that for as long as you're on earth, there will be occasions when very human thoughts, and disturbing ones sometimes, will come to your mind, but don't take them seriously and don't fight them. Just recognize them as having their source in the carnal mind and let them go. Don't make the mistake of claiming them. Oh, this is my thought, how terrible. It isn't my thought, it can't be. I have heard practitioners say when they didn't have results in a healing, you didn't believe or you weren't receptive to the treatment. I was under the impression that if the practitioner had the faith, anyone can be helped or healed completely. Is this true? Well, the second part isn't true, that anyone can be helped or healed completely. Definitely not. Definitely not. Nobody can drag us into heaven. And being spiritually healed doesn't just mean changing conditions of matter in the body. Those conditions of matter in the body won't change if there isn't a change of consciousness. And so there are those who are so adamant in their material living or materialistic sense of life that it's a hard thing to break through and bring out healing. Oh no, it hasn't been my experience that anyone can be healed. It has been my experience that about 90% of the people who come to us are healed, but not that anyone can be healed. There are many different things in the consciousness of an individual that may prevent healing, some of which they're consciously responsible and some for which they're not consciously responsible, things which have not yet come to the surface. But that is hardly a reason for a practitioner to alibi themselves. Now, to begin with, neither belief nor faith has anything to do with spiritual healing. Neither belief nor faith, in the accepted sense of those words. You may believe in God from now till doomsday, and that won't heal you. For even the heathens believe in God, some form of God, and their concept of God may not be any further from the base than your concept. Faith in God plays almost no part in healing. Let us take the 100,000 people who go to Lourdes every year. You know how much faith they have? Almost every one of those people, except a few local ones, spend thousands of dollars to get there. That's having an awful lot of faith. Some of those people mortgage their homes, sell their homes, some borrow. That's having a lot of faith. But out of 100,000 who go there each year, only 15 people get healed. Now, you wouldn't want to believe that only 15 people have faith after all the sacrifice they go to get there. And so faith has nothing to do with it. As a matter of fact, Dr. Carell says in his book that he investigated those 15 to see if there were anything in common one with another that accounted for just those 15 being healed. And you know what he discovered? He discovered that all 15 of those people went there and did not pray for themselves. They remembered somebody who was worse off than they were, and they prayed for someone else, and they got healed. All 15 that particular year. So you see, it really wasn't a matter of faith, it was self-forgetfulness, or forgetfulness of this little I self. See that? And that's love. And love is the healer. Not faith, love. Now, it is the same in our work. I have seen people over these years come to me so full of faith and so full of belief that they should have walked out instantaneously healed. And I've watched some of them for years and years and years with not a trace of benefit. And I've seen others come in so skeptical, I almost dare you to heal me, and they've walked out healed. No, spiritual healing is a strange thing because there are many factors in it responsible for the healing. The very first thing is a knowledge of the non-power of that which you're treating. That's the biggest factor in healing. I would call that 90% of what it takes in healing. Not faith in God, because God isn't going to heal anyone. That's an outmoded way of believing. God isn't going to heal anyone. If God were going to heal you tomorrow, he'd just well heal you today. If he's going to heal you through Brown, he'd just soon heal you through Jones. If he's going to heal you through a metaphysical practitioner, he'd just soon heal you through a Hebrew rabbi or a Catholic priest. What difference to make? They're all, to some extent, dedicated people. So why not one as well as another? No, I have found this. In proportion as error becomes unreal to you, that is, in proportion as you do not fear infection or contagion, in proportion as you do not fear the disease, in that proportion are you a good healer, and in that proportion do you do better healing work for those who come to you. If sometimes, you know, especially a young practitioner, get a call of a serious case, and like a fireman, they run to get the hat and coat and automobile out and run to visit the patient and sit by their bedside. That practitioner either isn't going to meet the case or it's going to take them a long, long time. They have accepted the reality of error, and they're running out to do something about it. After a while, they get seasoned, and somebody calls and says, come right away. I say, no, my body can't heal you. So no use taking my body over there. That part of me that can heal you is operating right now. Right here where I am, I'm knowing that God is the only power, and that is facing you is the arm of flesh or nothingness. And I haven't any fear of it, and I don't have to visit you. Why, as a matter of fact, you may be living here in Los Angeles and your next call comes from London. Now what are you going to do? Take a plane to go over there? Of course you're not. And neither are you going to refuse the case. You're going to sit right down where you are and come into your realization of God, not as a power over evil, but as the only power. And then you say, but what of evil? Well, then that leaves no power in evil. Well, then what have I to fear? I shall not fear what mortal man can do to me. I shall not fear what mortal condition can do to me. I shall not fear what appearance can do to me. I shall not fear what material law can do to me. All right, then. You will find then that if it isn't 90%, it's certainly 80% of all healing power is embraced in the practitioner's realization of the non-power of that which is presented to them. Jesus, standing before Pilate, said, thou couldst have no power over me unless it were given thee of God. And yet Pilate was the greatest temporal power in that neighborhood. And he said to the crippled man, what did hinder you? Now that's not going around looking for a God. That's just saying, what did hinder you? Pick up your bed and walk. That condition hasn't any power. To a blind man he said, open thine eyes. Nothing about God in it, nothing about faith, just open thine eyes. So, to another blind man, here, put a little spittle on it. You can't get more contemptuous of a power than that, can you? But you certainly don't think spittle is a healing power for blindness. And so it is that the greatest factor in healing is the practitioner's realization of the nature of evil. Once you know that evil is impersonal, it has nothing to do with your patient. It didn't start in them. It started back in the belief of good and evil. And once you know that that's only a belief, you're through with it. It's done. It's out. Now, that the healing doesn't always take place instantaneously can be due to the fact that the patient is just sitting there waiting for a change of matter and unwilling to yield these fears and faiths in matter and in material law and so forth and so on. In other words, you have a person adamant in their materiality, and you have a person hard to break through regardless of your... Yet if they'll stick with you and you'll stick with them, eventually you'll bring them through too. Now, but under no condition, even if a practitioner doesn't meet a case, should they blame the patient. There may be an occasion for saying to the patient, now wait a minute, you know, you're turning to us for spiritual help, but you're relying on that medicine bottle over there, and a house divided against itself must fall. Well, personally, unless a person is taking a material remedy in really fear of death, I mean, such as people with heart trouble use some kind of drops, and people with diabetes use other kind of drops, and in the beginning they're pretty reluctant to give them up because they know they're living by virtue of just those drops. If they don't know it, they believe it and feel it. And so when they come to you, they want to be healed, and they'd love to have a spiritual healing, but they're not yet ready to drop those drops. And I can see that. I can see that. And I can even go along with them if they're really trying to be healed for a while. But if they eventually show that they just intend to cling forever, then there's no use of taking up time, because it isn't time yet. Aside from cases like that, or cases that are in the hospital and have been virtually given up, or something of that kind, or desperate, you'll find that cooperating with materia medica is not going to help your patient and may prevent your healing, because you do have a house divided against yourself. You do have a house divided against their own selves, because they're not really looking for God at all. They're looking for healing, and it doesn't make a difference which way it comes. And of course, that isn't easy. You remember how Peter and John faced that. Here's a man begging at the gate, Temple Beautiful, and he's begging for money. But Peter and John say, "Silver and gold have I none. Such as I have give I unto thee." And that man was willing. He was willing not to have silver or gold. And so he was willing to take what they had. Well, very often we say, material things and material comfort I haven't got, but the Spirit of God, and then they'll hold back, "Oh yes, but I must have these drops. I must have this, I must have that." And that's where your difficulty comes in. I think you will find that the greatest difficulty in healing takes place with those who are still in the materia medica realm. That's where your greatest difficulty. I don't think you meet with very much difficulty in healing with those who have come to the metaphysical life or the spiritual life and have, at least in a great measure, lost their faith on material remedies. Even if at the time they may be using some, they've really lost most of their faith in it. But alibis aren't very good things. Do I understand this correctly? A student cannot go into this divine healing work and make these demonstrations of physical or other types of healing unless she or he has reached the stage of spiritual power to contact or touch the presence of God. Is this correct? Does this unfoldment for this kind of healing take years to attain? Well, actually, it is the spiritual consciousness that does the healing work. And a healing consciousness is based on this very point: the degree in which you, as an individual, have come to the place of being able to look at any phase of disease and say, I know thee who thou art, you have no power. That itself is the spiritual contact. As to whether or not it takes years, that is up to the individual. There are some people who read a book on truth and very quickly are in the practice. The man whom I consider one of the greatest healing practitioners that Los Angeles ever had was a man who got no further than the first chapter of Science and Health, and within a few days was in the healing practice. And from then to the end of his days, he not only was probably one of the biggest, most active, most successful, but I know him for years, and he was one of the greatest healing practitioners that set foot in this city or in many other cities that I know of. And with him it was a matter of about 3 or 4 days. And it was the first time he'd ever read the book. I have known, well, we have the story back of a woman in the early days of Christian Science who hadn't read Science and Health through, and who was sent to Germany to open the Christian Science work there, and she founded 3 churches over there and did such miracle healing work that all of Germany legalized Christian Science healing. And she hadn't yet read Science and Health through from cover to cover. So there's no such thing as time in God. One person touches this, and in an instant they are touched by the finger. Another person studies it for 20 years and doesn't reach it. Now, in your book, The Easter of Our Lives, you often speak of guardian angels. What do you mean by guardian angels? Yeah, you could mean almost anything. It's like the still small voice. What do you mean by the still small voice? Or, what do you mean by the Christ? I live, yet not I. Christ liveth in me. Or what do you mean by the Father? I can of my own self do nothing. The Father within me, He doeth the works. Does anybody know what those words mean? And the answer is no. If you think you have any idea at all of what those words mean, you're entirely incorrect. It isn't possible for anybody to know what those words mean. Those words mean something to the person who first voiced them. Do you know what Moses meant when he said, I am that I am? Why, it has puzzled the world from that day to this. Do we know what is meant? Why, the churches are still quarreling about what Jesus meant when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody's in agreement on that. When we speak of, or when I speak of guardian angels, I mean a spiritual influence, a protective influence, a presence. The Master spoke of guardian angels, didn't he? He said, I could call on legions of angels and they would come to me. What did he mean by that? It meant the same thing. A realization of the presence and power of God. But There are times when that still small voice is really an audible voice. You actually can hear it with your ears. There are times when you're so conscious of these guardian angels that sometimes you can feel a finger touching you, or hear a voice saying, "I'm with you." Any of these terms that are used in Christian mysticism, and all of these terms, the Christ, the Father within, guardian angels or angels, or the presence, the still small voice, that is all the terminology of Christian mysticism. All it means is the presence of God realized. And each one realizes the presence of God in a different way, and the same person realizes the presence of God in 100 different ways at different times under different circumstances. If you will remember, those of you who have read the story of Lindbergh on his first trip to Paris by plane, you will remember that many times he fell asleep. And each time he went way off course. Well, naturally, in those days, without mechanical gadgets, you had to be there yourself to keep yourself on course. He fell asleep and would wander way off course. And then he says that a voice in the back of the plane coming out of a man, an old pilot who had been killed years and years before, would tell him the adjustments to make to bring him back on course. And he says, now this is a miracle, when he left the States, he estimated that he would touch Europe somewhere between 100 and 500 miles of his set course. In other words, there would be that much fluctuation in arriving at where he was headed for. When he actually got there, he was within 50 miles. And always because this voice told him how to adjust his bearings when he woke up. Now, you might ask, was it the ghost of that dead pilot? Who knows? Probably not even Lindbergh himself. We can call it that. We can call it his guardian angel. We can call it the still small voice. We can call it the presence of God. We can call it the Christ. If we were Oriental, we could call it the Buddha, Brahm. What difference would it make what we called it? To us, the Master would call it the Father within, and Paul would call it the Christ. And there you have it. When you read these writings, please remember that you have a wide latitude for interpretation. This we answered. Why cannot all the illusions go all at once when we find our oneness with God? Actually, you shouldn't have worded it that way, because they can go all at once. They can. It is our material natures that makes it impossible for us to yield. Now, it won't be too difficult to tell you some of the reasons why it doesn't, why they all don't go at once. Let's refer to the Master. Leave mother, brother, father, sister for my sake. And ask yourself if you're fulfilling that qualification. Have you left this world completely behind? When you find the pearl, sell all that you have to purchase it. I've heard people complain about a $2 book. Here they're told, sell all that thou hast to buy it. Give up mother, brother, sister, father. Give up everything. No, you see, what we would like to do is to add spiritual qualities to our present humanhood. And every one of us are in the same boat. No exceptions. Later we come to the place where we would gladly give up mother, brother, father, sister. But in the beginning, it's a child or it's a grandchild. It's something or other. And that's why all of the illusions, we want to hug at least one or two of the illusions to us for a while. At times references are made to Scripture literally, at other times spiritually. How can one know when the Bible is to be taken literally and when spiritually? Well, actually, when it comes to principles, there isn't anything in the Bible at all that's to be taken literally. The only time one could take the Bible literally is probably when they're talking about dates or some names, some locales, and even then some of that's questionable. But when it comes to principles, nothing can be taken literally. The sun didn't stand still for Joshua, and it isn't likely that the Red Sea opened for Moses. No, the Bible is a presentation of spiritual principles and must be spiritually discerned. And when anyone attempts to take the incidents literally, they lose the principle. Even if there were a literal experience at the time, its only purpose in being in the Bible is to illustrate a spiritual principle, because those who compiled those manuscripts were not interested in writing history. They were not interested in writing stories. All that they meant to bring through was spiritual reality, and they presented it in the language necessary. Actually, all of the troubles, well, not all, but I suppose 3/4 of all the troubles in the world is due to the quarrels about the Bible, and whether or not we should be baptized by being dunked entirely or half dunked. That caused a lot of dissension in the church world. And you know what the Master said of it? Suffer it to be so now. That doesn't sound as if he really meant that it was of any importance or would be 2,000 years from now. But it still carried on 2,000 years from now, that which he said, suffer it to be so now. And so it is. They have to find passages to justify why they're still building billion-dollar temples when he said there's no need of worshiping in temples. And something later about temples not made with hands. And so it is that to be concerned with a literal interpretation of the Bible will never promote one's spiritual progress. Please differentiate between the messages from saints and sages on the other planes and the messages from the still small voice. There are no differences there. That's going back to the same thing. whether it appears to come as an ancient saint or sage, or whether it seems to come merely as a voice without any human accompaniment, makes no difference. The source of it is God, even if it comes through the consciousness of an individual. And very often, even when the still small voice comes without any sense of it being a saint or sage, that doesn't mean that there isn't one there. When the woman suffers the issue of blood, issue of blood, touched Christ's robe, his virtue had gone out of him. What is this virtue? And here you're going to find in the next 10 years that many words were incorrectly translated. Now, ancient scripture appears in an ancient Hebrew language, and toward the Master's day in Aramaic. But very quickly it's translated into Greek and then into Latin. And it is only within the last couple of years that there is a New Testament that was actually translated from the original Greek. Up until a few years ago, all of our translations were made from much, much later translations of Latin and a few late Greek. So that what actual word may have been meant here, who knows? We know what it means. It means that the Master had the feeling of healing going through him, or he had the feeling of the Spirit within him. That happens to practically every practitioner on the face of the globe. That at some of their healings they can actually feel as if it were something rushing out of them. It's really not rushing out of them, it's really they're feeling the Spirit of God in them. And so there again, let's not be too literal about these things, and go back to see the meaning of it and be satisfied that the Master knew he had been touched, and he felt this power of God flow forth. What did Jesus mean? Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Why worry about it before it comes? Why take thought about it before it comes? Why not live unto today and not live on yesterday's manna, or fear that there won't be any tomorrow? Let us take each problem as it arises without building future ones. This is interesting. What is the infinite way viewpoint regarding the theory of evolution? Now, if you're speaking of evolution in accord with Darwin's theory, I wouldn't know. Because I have never been interested in the changes of material form, and it doesn't enter my spiritual life. The secret of life is in the word evolution. But that may not necessarily be from rising from a monkey to a man. Except that at some time, I guess we're all monkeys, or we are made a monkey of, or we make monkeys of someone else. And if so, there's a need for evolution to bring us to the point of being a man. Actually, however, we start out in life, and this that I give you now is the revelation that has been constant and continuous for at least 4,000 to 5,000 known years, and is actually the secret of our life. We began as pure spiritual being, the image and likeness of God. That was our beginning. Our beginning was actually God manifest as individual you and me. In what way it happened, we're not going to quibble, but it happened that a belief of good and evil arose in consciousness, and this set up a sense of separation from our true identity until gradually we built up the belief that we're human beings, or the belief was built up in us that we are human beings, separate and apart from God, and that we are living on our own intelligence, on our own strength, and that we live primarily by virtue of food. Wasn't there a book about you are what you eat? Yeah. Of course, you know that isn't true. You're something much finer than that. Now, what you are is pure spiritual being. The very Christ of God, the very Son of God, the very Buddha. And because of this experience, this acceptance of two powers, good and evil, we became prodigals. And we wandered off, and we began to use up our substance, our strength, our health, our mentality, until eventually we ended up almost as an animal man, clawing our way through life, robbing, stealing, murdering, everything else. This is the prodigal state of consciousness. Now, at some point or other, we are directed in a different direction. It may be because there's an innate hunger for God or truth or ultimate reality, or it may be that we're so sick or so poverty-stricken that we say, well, why not try God? Something points us in the direction of something higher than our animality, our own wisdom, our own strength. And this is the return of the prodigal to the Father's house. And in this period is our period of evolution. Now, in our lowest state, we are material beings. That is, in this state of prodigality, and we live by physical strength. We live by physical powers. And the strongest man, of course, gets the most of everything. It's purely a physical universe. Everything we do is by the power of muscle, power of might, power of bullets. As we are directed, all of a sudden, we discover the mental realm. Now, this realm was discovered back surely 7,000 BC. And here men began to find in their minds great powers. It was those great powers that built pyramids. It was those great powers, it was those great mental powers that laid out rivers. It was the great powers that built the temple, Solomon's temple, and all the rest of them. In the mind of man is so tremendous that if you ever start to plumb the depths of your mind, you will find that you're virtually infinite even in the mind. And the powers of the mind are great. You can do wonderful things with the mind. And out of the mind come great laws, mental laws, and great mental powers, and great secrets of nature. Man has now evolved to a mental level of life. And when the printing press came into being, this helped man more than anything else, because now he had the world of books open to him, of literature, of mathematics, of art, not only to a few scholars, but to men and women all over the world. There was open, the realm of mind was open. And And then, throughout these ages, a very few people, and very, very few, reached the spiritual kingdom. Oh, they are so few. You'd be surprised how few. Because all of the religions that have been founded and that are supposed to be spiritual and have God as their theme, there isn't one of them that's ever gone beyond the mental realm. The only people who have ever touched the spiritual realm are the mystics. Now, I don't mean that there haven't been some mystics inside the church, but I mean the church itself has never been a spiritual creation, never had a spiritual foundation, and what's more, never had a true God. Not any church that ever existed. All they had were the powers of the mind, and they built a faith. And once they built the faith, whether that faith was in Buddha or Jesus or Moses, or whether that faith was in some other character, or whether the faith was in carrying a crucifix, or whether the faith was in St. Anthony's bones, it all was a mental projection from within the mind. But here and there throughout the ages, there have been individuals. One of the first to come to world attention is in the name Krishna. Now, nobody knows the identity of anybody named Krishna, because Krishna antedates all known history. And the root word for Krishna, which is identical with Christ, means spiritual source or light. And so it is that Krishna, the original, was one of those who actually had touched the kingdom of God. Gautama, the Buddha, was another. Jesus was another. John was another. There were quite a few others back in those days. Elijah, of course, was one. Moses became one at Mount Horeb. And then, after the Master, we have had Plotinus as probably the father of modern mysticism.